Chapter 9. The Vanishing Patient. Excited by the sleuthing ahead of them, Nancy, Bess, and George arose early the following morning. Since the Weather Bureau predicted a hot day, the girls put on lightweight cotton dresses. "I wish I felt as cool as I look," said Bess, staring at herself in the mirror. "I think we're hot on the trail of something, and it makes me even hotter to think about it." Nancy and Bess laughed, and George remarked, "I hope the only cooling-off swim I have today will not be in the moat, but in the motel pool." Bess's reaction to the pun was to throw a pillow at her cousin. Still laughing, Nancy went to the motel lobby and phoned for a taxi to take them to the diner for breakfast. When they finished eating, Nancy said she wanted to make 2 phone calls, one to the hospital and the other to police headquarters. "To find out about Mr. Wheeler and about your car?" Bess asked. Nancy nodded. The hospital wires were busy, so Nancy called police headquarters. She learned that there was no word yet of her car. With a sigh, she again dialed the hospital, only to get a busy signal. "I'll stop there later," the young sleuth said to herself. She came back to her friends and reported her findings. Then she said, "It's rather early to call on the Armstrongs. I have a suggestion. Let's find out how far it is to Willow Road. We might walk there instead of calling a taxi and take a look at Mr. Seaman's house." "Why don't we call on him?" George suggested. "Let's decide what to do when we get there." Nancy found out from the waitress that Willow Road was only about a half-mile away. The girls decided to walk. They set out at a brisk pace. On the way, Bess brought up the subject of Nancy's mysterious gift of a moonstone. "Do you realize we have never had one single clue to explain that?" "I know," said Nancy. "But I feel that sooner or later the donor is going to give himself or herself away." George began to tease Nancy once more about the mysterious person being an admirer. She said, "Wait until Ned gets here. You probably can trap him into confessing." Nancy was spared the necessity of a retort because Bess called out, "This is Willow Road." The girls turned down the street and presently reached the address given to Nancy by the police. Number 24 gave every evidence of being deserted. Grass, weeds, and unkempt flowers were tall. 2 small chairs on the porch lay upside down, as if the wind had blown them over. "I'm sure no one is living here," she said, "but we'll ring the bell anyhow." She pushed the button and also clapped the knocker, but there was no response. "This sure complicates our case," said George. "I wonder," Nancy mused, "whether it was just a phony address Mr. Seaman used, knowing the house was vacant, or whether he's staying away from it for some particular reason." "Oh, let's forget him," Bess suggested. "I'm more interested in what we're going to find out about Joanie Armstrong." It was a mile to the Armstrong home, but by walking it, the girls arrived there at a reasonable hour for calling. As they went up the front walk, Nancy whispered to the cousins, "We'll have to be careful not to mention the subject of Joanie and the adoption. Her parents may be touchy about it and not want to know who Jodie's real parents might have been. Let's hope Mrs. Armstrong brings up the matter." "You're right," said Bess. "Let's not give any hint as to what we're trying to find out." "I have the picture of Joanie Horton in my purse," said Nancy. "If we can only see a picture of Joanie taken soon after the Armstrongs adopted her, perhaps we could compare the 2 in private." Hopefully, the 3 girls went to the door, and Nancy rang the bell. A pleasant, attractive woman of 40 answered. She smiled at the callers. "Mrs. Armstrong?" Nancy inquired. "Yes?" Nancy told of having met Amy Cadmus and Amy's suggestion that the girls get in touch with Joanie. "We're staying at a motel and don't know anyone in town." "Do come in." Mrs. Armstrong invited the callers. "I'm sorry Jody isn't here. She went with her father on a business trip and won't be home until this evening." Nancy smiled. "We'll have to see your daughter another time then," she said. "Please don't go," Mrs. Armstrong said cordially. "I'm going to be lonesome here by myself all day. I'd love to talk to you. Tell me how you happened to come to Deep River." At once, Bess spoke up. "Mother knew about the darling motel here." "It is a very attractive place," Mrs. Armstrong agreed. After a little while, Nancy remarked, "Jodine is a lovely but rather unusual name." "Yes, it is," Mrs. Armstrong agreed. She looked into space for a few seconds, then added, "Mr. Armstrong and I didn't give it to her. We adopted our daughter, and that was the name she had." "Have you always called her Jody?" Bess asked. Mrs. Armstrong said that the nickname, too, had already been given to their daughter, apparently by her own mother. The adoption took place many years ago. There's no secret to the story. People around here know it. Jody herself has been told what happened, but I doubt that she ever thinks about it. We love her very much, and we're her parents now. Mrs. Armstrong revealed that when Jody was about 3 years of age, she was left at the Adoption Society in the town next to Deep River. Mr. Armstrong and I had asked for a child, and when Jody was offered to us, we both fell in love with her. She had been found asleep in the lounge of the society. There was a note pinned to her dress which said that she was Joanie Horton, and her nickname was Jody. Scrawled on the paper were the words, "I am giving up all rights to this child and offer her for adoption. Her mother." There was a somewhat awkward pause. Then Nancy, smiling, said, "But everything has turned out wonderfully for her." "We hope so. Jody has always been an adorable child. That's she in the picture on the piano." The 3 girls arose to go look at the photograph of a tall, slender, attractive, dark-haired girl. "She's darling!" Bess exclaimed. As Nancy and George added their compliments, Mrs. Armstrong beamed delightedly. "She photographs so well," said Nancy. "You must have taken lots of pictures of her." She hoped fervently that Mrs. Armstrong would bring out some of them. "Oh, yes, indeed," the woman said. "But as the years go on, the older pictures somehow get up to the attic and are packed away." Nancy felt that the girls had stayed long enough. She merely remarked that she was more eager than ever to meet Jody, and asked that the girl get in touch with her as soon as it was convenient. Jody's mother promised to give her the message, then said, "I want my daughter to meet you girls, too." She accompanied her 3 callers to the door and then said goodbye. As they walked up the street arm in arm, Bess asked, "Well, did we learn anything or not?" "I'm puzzled by that note which was pinned to Jody's dress," said Nancy. "If, by any chance, she is Joanie Horton, you will admit there is a great similarity in names, then the little girl probably was kidnapped, and the note was a forgery, since her mother wasn't living. By getting the child out of the way, an impostor was able to claim Mrs. Horton's estate." Nancy went on to say that if this theory were true, the person who had perpetrated the kidnapping and theft had thought out the plan in great detail, even to the name. The little girl had been old enough to say her own name, so a pseudonym had been chosen which was similar. "You mean," Bess said, "if she gave her name as Joanie Horton, people might think she was mispronouncing Jody Holt?" Nancy nodded. "I do hope Jody gets in touch with us," she remarked. "If she does, I don't think we should mention adoption to her. Let's see if we can pick up any clues about her childhood, though." "What are we going to do now?" Bess asked. "I think our next stop should be the hospital," Nancy replied, "to find out how Mr. Wheeler is. I hope he'll be well enough to see us. I want to ask him who the man is that he wanted us to meet." The girls entered the hospital lobby. There was a great commotion. Nurses and doctors were talking excitedly with two policemen. Wondering what had happened, Nancy went up to the desk and asked the nurse's aide on duty if she and her friends might see Mr. Wheeler. "Mr. Wheeler!" the aide cried out. "He's the patient who was kidnapped from here this morning." Nancy stared in stupefaction as the nurse's aide called out to members of the hospital staff, "Here's somebody who knows Mr. Wheeler." At once, Nancy was surrounded and plied with questions. She said she knew nothing about what had happened. "I was with Mr. Wheeler last night when he had the boat accident." "Are you the girl who saved his life?" asked one of the doctors. Nancy blushed. "Well, my friend over there and I did." She beckoned for George to come forward with Bess. They too were stunned to hear that Mr. Wheeler was missing from the hospital. One of the nurses explained. "It happened before visiting hours began," she said. "We have a very ill patient on the 3rd floor where Mr. Wheeler was. All the nurses on duty there were in the woman's room for a while. We pieced the story together. Apparently a man dressed as an orderly and a woman as a nurse came in, put Mr. Wheeler on an operating cart, and took him by elevator to the lowest level. There they must have transferred him to a wheelchair and taken him off by car." "How dreadful!" Bess exclaimed. "Didn't he make any protest or outcry?" Nancy queried. "Mr. Wheeler was only semi-conscious," the nurse replied. "We had even put the side guards up on his bed so he would be safe when left alone." One of the policemen quizzed Nancy and her friends, asking if they could give any clue as to who the abductors might be. "I'm afraid not," Nancy replied. "We're strangers in town. We're vacationing at the Longview Motel. Mr. Wheeler attended a party we were at last night and took George and myself out in his boat." "With a disastrous ending," George added. Nancy asked permission to speak to any nurses on duty who might have helped to take care of Mr. Wheeler. She was told that the only one in the hospital at the moment who had taken care of him was Mrs. Straff on the 3rd floor, but Nancy was welcome to go ahead and speak to her. The nurse was a kindly, middle-aged woman. She said she felt perfectly dreadful about the kidnapping and could not understand how it had occurred. "I guess we were all with that sick woman longer than we thought." "I do hope the authorities will find him soon," said Nancy. "I don't know Mr. Wheeler very well. He was taking me across the river to see an acquaintance of his. I didn't learn the person's name, and I'm curious to know who he is." "Did Mr. Wheeler ever talk while he was semi-conscious?" "Oh, yes, he mumbled a great deal," Mrs. Straff replied. "I couldn't get much out of it, but maybe the name of the person you're trying to find out about is the one he kept repeating. It was Peter Judd. I've never heard of him." "He may be the man," said Nancy, and thanked the woman for the information. The girls left the hospital. When they were on the street once more, Nancy smiled and said, "I'll bet Mrs. Hemstead will know who Peter Judd is." Bess and George giggled, and the girls turned toward the brass kettle. "We'll have an early lunch," Nancy remarked. "We may see Mrs. Hemstead first. Remember, you're to call me Irene." "Oh, that's right," said Bess. "Lead the way, Miss Irene Innsbruck." The three friends walked through the door of the tea room. As usual, Mrs. Hemstead was seated in her rocker, wearing the same black dress with the ruching collar. The instant she saw the girls, her wrinkled face broke into a great grin. In her high-pitched voice, she asked, "Well, how are you, Nancy Drew, detective?" End of Chapter 9.